In this lesson, you're going to learn about precedent transactions, how we use them in evaluation, and then how we can determine valuation multiples based on some of the operating metrics that I have displayed right here. So what I've done here is taken the list of 6 precedent transactions or comparable transactions that we looked at previously when we had narrowed down our set from around 20 or 30 down to this set of 6. And over here, I filled in some of this information on equity value, enterprise value, revenue, and EBITDA. Now, most of this follows directly from what we did on our public company comparable sheet. So I'm not going to go over the parts that are already covered there. But I do want to cover a few things here because some of the terms and some of the numbers here are different in the context of precedent transactions. The first question you might have here is, what exactly do equity value and enterprise value mean in the context of transactions? Because with public company comparables, it's obvious. We're talking about a company at a specific instant in time, and we're looking at that company's value at that point in time. But what does it mean when we're dealing with transactions? Well, it's actually very similar. Basically, all we would do here to get to equity value and enterprise value for these transactions is the following. Similar to what we did when we calculated all these numbers for Hewlett-Packard, what we would do is we would go in here and using the 3Com example right here, we'd enter 3Com for the name. Rather than valuation date, we would have announcement date. This is the date the transaction was announced. So in this case, November 11th, 2009. And then instead of their current share price, what we would want to include here is the offer price. So when HP actually made the offer to acquire 3Com, what price was it done at? And then we would go through 3Com's filings and we would fill in all the rest of the information. So if HP made an offer to acquire 3Com for $35 per share, let's say, then we would go through their filings, pull all this information on equity value, enterprise value, and then the rest would really be the same. We would pull their historical revenue, EBITDA, and then look at equity research for the forward numbers. So the entire process here of finding information is pretty much the same. And all equity value and enterprise value here mean in the context of these precedent transactions is the equity value at acquisition, the enterprise value at acquisition. So when HP actually acquired 3Com, what type of equity value were they paying? What type of enterprise value were they paying for 3Com? And that's the only difference here. Now for these trailing and forward revenue and EBITDA multiples, so the difference here versus public company comparables is that when we look at trailing revenue, and I will just use the EMC data domain transaction here as an example. Trailing revenue here refers to the previous 12 months before the acquisition date. So in this case, the date is July 8th, 2009. So in this case, the trailing revenue would be going from June 30th, 2008 to June 30th, 2009. And so that's how that differs. We saw that with public company comparables, we normalized the data to Apple's fiscal year. With precedent transactions, we normalize it to the transaction announcement date, and we take the previous 12 months before that. The forward numbers are pretty much the same. We just get them from equity research. So those are really the key differences in terms of precedent transactions versus what we saw with public company comparables. Now in terms of the multiples here, this is the part where you're going to actually get some practice calculating these for yourself. So what I want you to do right now is to actually go in and calculate the trailing and forward revenue and EBITDA multiples. So take enterprise value and divide by revenue and EBITDA, depending on what you're looking at, and then just copy that formula down. And then you can also fill in this part at the bottom for maximum down through minimum. And you can take a look at the Excel formulas if you've forgotten how to do that, but it's good to get some practice doing this yourself so you can see again how to calculate the multiples. Remember that the F4 key, so when we press the F4 key, that anchors the cell. If we press it once, it anchors only the row. If we press it twice, it anchors only the column. So remember that shortcut key. But pause this video right now, give this a shot yourself, and then when you're done, you can unpause the video, and then I'll walk you through how to enter all the formulas for the valuation multiples here. Okay, good. So here's what we do to get the multiples. So for the revenue multiple, I'm just going to take enterprise value. I'm going to hit F4 once the first time, twice to anchor the row. What we really want to do here is anchor the column, so I'll press it 3 times. and then I will divide by the revenue over here. And I can actually just copy this formula as is throughout the rest of this area with Alt ESF. We see pressing F2 that everything appears to be working correctly here. One thing I want to do here is also add in some error checking. So for example, if we have a company that doesn't have forward revenue or forward EBITDA, we want to display not available. If we have a company where it's negative, if we have a negative EBITDA, for example, we want to display not meaningful. So I'm going to add in some error checking right here. I'm going to say if this is an error, then we display NA for not available. Otherwise, we will display this. And that fixes the first case here. What we also want to do is add in something that checks to make sure that this is over 0. So we're going to say if that's over 0, then we simply display it as is. Otherwise, we display not meaningful. And that should give us the proper error checking that we need here. So that's what we do for filling in the multiples there. Again, the key shortcut keys are F4 to anchor the entire cell or just the row or just the column, and then Control C, and then Alt ESF using the Shift Control and arrow keys to select this whole area, and Alt ESF to paste everything throughout. For these formulas at the bottom, we could actually just copy the max to min formulas right here. I'm going to actually enter them again. Say max, quartile, the 75th percentile is the third quartile, so we're going to enter 3 right here. Median, then the 25th percentile is the first quartile. And then the minimum, we just use the min function. So we have those in place, and once again, I'm going to copy them across with Alt ESF. So we have all this set up. So now that we've calculated all these numbers, what do these multiples actually tell us about these transactions and Apple's valuation? So comparing the revenue multiples here, the median specifically, to the public comps page, we can see that they're well above the median in the set, almost 3 times, and they're actually in line with Apple's own revenue multiples right here. So that's interesting to point out. And it tells us that, as we'd expect, the precedent transactions are valued more highly than the public company comparables here, and also that Apple's own multiples are in line with the median of the set. For the EBITDA multiples, so the median EBITDA multiples here are actually well above the median of the set here, almost twice that, and also significantly higher than Apple's own EBITDA multiples as well. Now, to be honest, these numbers are a little weird because if you look at them, you see that in many cases, the company is actually getting less EBITDA in the future. So many of these companies were either shrinking or becoming less profitable, which is quite strange, not something that you see every day. So these numbers admittedly are a little bit weird, but even if you look at the trailing EBITDA multiples, they're still well above what you see here for Apple and the rest of the set. Part of this just reflects the fact that in general, precedent transactions will give you a higher valuation because of the control premium. You need to pay something extra to actually acquire the company. So that's part of this here. The other reason that these multiples tend to be higher is that these companies are smaller and higher growth. If you go back and look at the historical revenue growth numbers, many of these companies were growing at a much faster rate than we saw with the average, the median of our set here of 8.4%, for example. So many of these companies were just growing more quickly, and that explains why they were valued more highly by the market as well. We can tell from this that our valuation based on precedent transactions will definitely give us a higher number than the public company comparables one. We'll see exactly how it compares later on when we make a graph to show everything visually, but that's what we can really tell from these multiples here. Usually with precedent transactions, you don't go too far beyond this. Typically, you have less data available to you, so usually you only look at trailing and forward revenue, EBITDA, maybe PE multiples, depending on the set of companies, but you normally don't go back and forward 2 years or 3 years as you might with public company comparables. So that's an overview of how the analysis for precedent transactions is different than it is for public company comparables, how you pull in the information, how you calculate the multiples, and then what the multiples can actually tell you about our valuation and Apple's valuation relative to the median of the set here. Coming up in the next part of this valuation, we'll be looking at a discounted cash flow analysis for Apple. And we'll be seeing how we can use that to come up with an intrinsic valuation for the company and see how that compares to our public company comparables and precedent transactions.